So thanks, Tom, for the introduction, and thanks for the warm welcome here at the Urban Institute and Sheffield Urbanism. As mentioned, I'm the General Director at the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies, and that means I get very anxious when I'm asked to talk about my research, because so much of my time is spent administering and coordinating and firefighting. And I also feel a little anxious because, as Tom indicated, the work that I've done hasn't necessarily followed a clear academic research trajectory. And so I'll really sort of try to tie together things that I think are relevant and interesting from my work that I've done on practical and policy relevant projects and activities, some things that I've done that are more academically oriented, and then quite a bit that's been done through and with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which again, Vanessa and I will talk a little bit more about these global reports and processes in the discussion session on Thursday. Going back to first principles and the things which I think motivated the overall areas of research that I've engaged with, starting with PhD research in the Caribbean and Jamaica in the early 2000s. And the sort of theoretical foundation and the people who I was working with and who I found influential at that time, people like Eric Spingadar, Maria Kaika, very much from the sort of David Harvey school of thinking about the David Harvey Neil Smith school of thinking about the relationships between nature and society. And I was very struck by phrases like this from David Harvey about the link between ecological and socio-political arguments. I was very struck by the way in which discourses about the environment in cities, particularly in Caribbean cities where I was working, really prioritized broadly middle class and elite concerns of greenery and cleanliness. They linked things like poverty with environmental degradation. They ignored the everyday surroundings, built environment concerns of low-income groups like water, sanitation, solid waste management. And they ignored the activity and actions of low-income groups in cities in addressing these through things like recycling and many of the day-to-day things that just kept cities working. And how at worst these approaches to, or these views of the environment actively legitimize the limiting of access to land and services for low-income groups. So an approach to the environment and society that was informed both by these sort of very nice activist sort of statements from Chico Mendes, but also these more conceptual arguments. And I carried this to the work that I've been doing since about 2008, working on urban climate change in African and Asian cities. And Tom, very kind that you said that in 2011, people already knew I was working on that. I mean, I was very fortunate to work with some of the people who really did just start that as an agenda. And what I've been, I suppose, trying to do broadly on that is try to recognize and the severity and extent of the climate emergency in urban areas and trying to understand the differential effects of this. And more recently, to try and understand how different responses to the global climate emergency, both adaptation and mitigation, but also the kinds of projects and policies and financing, intersect with the other factors which create or erode well-being, resilience, insecurity, fragility, for low-income urban residents. So I've got the word urban in sort of scare quotes or brackets, partly because I think this, well, we are speaking on Sheffield urbanism, and I work at the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies, and I do identify as an urban geographer. But I'm seeing it as a a particular way of framing some of these issues, which are both to do with systems within cities and systems between cities, but also the links between climate change and climate responses as a global crisis and a global response, but ones that are manifested in particular ways in towns and cities, and one in which the responses need to be implemented in towns and cities as well. So I'll only do quite briefly, the sort of framing of the urban climate emergency. I think many of these aspects around what the global climate emergency is are very well known and well understood by most people, but to try and link some of them together a little bit. And to start with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. So the most recent assessment report for the IPCC was concluded in 2023. I've been so used to saying last year, and now it's already nearly 2 years ago. I found this probably the most alarming figure out of hundreds or thousands of figures in the report, as an indication of just how far the global response to climate change, to limiting emissions and hence limiting dangerous global warming, how far the existing contributions and efforts are from reaching what they need to be if we're to have any chance to reach the stated goals of keeping warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. And this is a challenging policy space to operate in, because we have to, on one hand, pretend that we're keeping 1.5 alive, because this is a stated goal, this is a stated purpose of many of the international efforts. And on the other, we have to recognize that keeping 1.5 alive is absolutely impossible without fairly significant changes to emissions pathways. And of course, this is a very urban dimension as well, because so many of the emitting activities, transport, the way that cities and towns are planned, energy usage, consumption patterns are very urban in the ways that they take place. So we know then that this will happen in cities, and increasingly the global circulation models include increasingly the various atmospheric projections, and the localized models highlight what is going to happen in urban areas. And the working group of the IPCC that focuses on this is able to highlight the ways in which the characteristics of the built environment through buildings, through infrastructure, through changes in the surface characteristics will mean that higher temperatures will be felt even more severely in cities, and that extreme sea level will particularly affect urban areas at the coast. How flooding from runoff from in more intense precipitation events will be more severe flooding in cities. So we can see what some of these changes will be in terms of the impact. But I guess I'm more interested in what the adverse effects will be of those diverse actual changes in the climate. And this is also from the IPCC, and I think it's quite relevant here, because it highlights that cities, settlements, and infrastructure are one of a relatively small set of areas where they say there will be widespread and substantial impacts and related losses and damages that are attributed to climate change. And the IPCC historically hasn't focused very much on cities. The first reports had very little focus on urbanization. It was seen very much as being too much about governance and institutions and social science for a body which saw its mandate on climate change as a physical or atmospheric phenomenon. So it's interesting that cities, settlements, and infrastructure are now seen as being a key area in which adverse impacts from human-caused climate change will intensify. And it's also relevant, I think, that it's in association with these other areas in which adverse impacts will continue to intensify, which are pretty fundamental to the way that towns and cities function. Health and well-being, the concerns of health and well-being being more felt in places where where there is dense human settlement, in places where the infrastructure to support health is weak or limited or absent. The issues around water availability and food production being fundamental for cities being able to even function, and therefore having knock-on effects as well. So that's really something of a prelude to say why, one of the reasons why I think, among the reasons why I think that focusing on climate emergency in urban areas really is relevant and important. Hopefully then this leads a little bit into some of the research that I'll talk a bit about. And the first broad area of research that I'm going to talk about is how different factors shape risk in cities, how the nature of cities, some of the fundamental characteristics of cities and how they function in different places creates or shapes risk. And with a particular focus on the dynamics in informal settlements and how this links with things like labour and employment. I'm also going to not talk so much about, but it also the links with things like displacement, refugees, and gender and intersectionality. And when we think about risk in cities and particularly in informal settlements, I think it's very helpful to use a framing that sees risk as an outcome of these three factors in the propeller diagram, as we call it on the left, of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. And that if we're thinking about how to understand and address risk in cities, and particularly in low-income settlements, we need to focus on, but not only on, the physical changes, the hazards, what is going to be experienced in terms of more intense precipitation events, more intense heat waves, but that it's not going to affect everybody or every city equally. These issues of exposure, who is exposed, which areas are exposed, which people are exposed, both because of the physical location as an outcome of the way in which urban areas have evolved and developed, been planned or not planned over time. And vulnerability is the inherent characteristics of a system, an ecosystem, a built environment system, a human system, a social system, which create a susceptibility to harm. And so in the face of a similar hazard, we can have very different levels of risk. And for a lot of the work that certainly when we were starting to work on climate change in cities, a lot of the work that we did was really to try and unpack what created risk for different cities and for different groups of people within cities. And I think this is relatively well understood now, except we begin to expand the framework and understanding into new areas as well. So I'm always wary of going back to this paper because of the title and the sort of assumption that African urbanization is a thing which we can clearly define. I mean, African urbanization includes Kisumu and Dodoma and includes Cairo and Cape Town. It's a very problematic to try and do a single sort of grouping for that. But as so often, the project was on African urbanization, and so we have to use the category of African urbanization. But what we did try to do was to, at this time, try and unpack what are some of the specific characteristics of urban form and urban processes in Africa, which maybe helped to drive risk and that we needed to understand before trying to address and reduce risk in different settings. And so we unpacked some of these ideas around urban form and the way in which, in different areas, in different parts of Africa, this had happened in different ways. But things like rapid spatial expansion, and what does that mean for the creation of risk through added exposure, through the location of settlements on floodplains in coastal areas? Or what about the particular nature of urban societies, and how can we unpack that in different places? What does the overall demographic profile of a city mean for the creation of risk? If you have a younger population or an older population, where you have changing gender dynamics as a result of urbanization, different ways in which women and men are in the workforce, different ways in which the social expectations around responding to hazards of different kinds, or responsibility, domestic responsibilities of different kinds, result in risk being distributed unevenly on a gendered basis. Or what about urban economies and urban governance? What are the particular drivers of risk when you have a small industrial sector or where you have a very large informal sector? One of the things we found around governance is that there were elements around the lack of technical and financial capacity, but much more around the lack of integrated mechanisms for risk governance, that processes of planning, transportation planning, spatial planning, health planning, education planning were disjointed and didn't lend themselves to addressing risk in an integrated way, which was seen as being one of the key things which drove additional risk. I've also been particularly interested in the way in which risk is created in informal settlements. This is both a demographic imperative, I think. These are the latest figures from UN Habitat that have about 1 billion people living in slum or slum-like conditions in urban areas, and the expectation that an additional 2 billion people will live in those conditions over the next 30 years. So even though the proportion of the global urban population living in slums is declining slightly, the number continues to rise. And it's an agenda, I think, if we're addressing risk in cities, that needs to be looked at, both because of this sheer demographic weight of having billions of people living in slum or slum-like conditions, and also because the challenge of planning for risk reduction in places which are essentially unplanned in many ways requires a different way of engaging with risk reduction than can be done through some of the more formal mechanisms which are often put forward, and where there are wonderful sets of planning frameworks for addressing urban climate risk. So we can begin to unpack that as well. What are the ways in which particular hazards have particular consequences for risk in low-income and informal settlements? And if we look through the whole suite of hazards that we can see that we expect in cities, we can see the particular manifestation of them in informal settlements and slums. That the urban form, that the way in which the density and also the characteristics of housing in slums and informal settlements means that higher temperatures are experienced much more severely. And there's detailed empirical work that looks at the indoor temperatures in slum housing, where there are uninsulated roofs and walls, where there is higher temperatures affecting people, particularly who have workshops in their homes. There's some very nice work done by Rob Wilby and his colleagues in Loughborough that's measured temperatures of 60 degrees, 65 degrees and more in the workshops where people are sewing or doing blacksmithing work in cities in Ghana. If we take the hazard of urban flooding, we know this is more likely to affect low-income and informal areas because of their location. There's a spatial dimension to this, located on floodplains outside of the areas that are formally planned in the city, but also an infrastructural dimension to it, the absence or poor maintenance of drainage and other facilities. Urban water scarcity and urban water security in settings which are already very frequently water scarce with very expensive water. The costs for water for people who have to buy informally from vendors being tens or hundreds of times more than for people who have the provision of piped water. So when you compound that water scarcity with lowering of water tables and with the weakening of public water supply systems, it becomes a particular challenge in informal settlements. And all sorts of other dynamic interactions around wind, air pollution, landslides, where housing offers limited protection and where informal settlements are in hazarded locations with limited protective infrastructure. So this has been sort of an overall framing of the links between informality and risk, which you can dig into in different ways as well, and dig into it for things like outdoor work and how particular groups of workers are going to be more severely affected by climate change. Informal workers often working in the most difficult conditions, with increasing epidemiological evidence of the kinds of impacts that this has on health, both the short-term impact from heat stress and exhaustion, but also much longer-term health impacts around kidney disease and cardiovascular stress. And compounded as well by the access or the lack of access to social protection, the absence of sick pay or pensions, the lack of any health or safety in the workplace for people in the informal sector, meaning that there's this compound effect not only on health but also on household income from daily work and from the lack of protections when people are not able to work. See it linked as well with issues of gender and migration status, in particularly around access to social protection for migrants in some countries and for refugees in almost all countries, and the forcing of people into the informal sector for employment. So particular ways of compounding risk based around informality, both in settlement and around employment and livelihoods. So perhaps more recently, though, there's been more research and effort into thinking about how responses to climate change do or can reduce risk, do or can contribute to global climate goals, or have negative or unintended consequences. Because the way in which policies are applied seldom results in exactly the consequences or exactly the desired outcomes. And that's as true for climate policies as for any other kinds of policies. So a second area of research then, looking into this. A lot of the urban responses to climate risk have focused around infrastructures of various kinds. And Vanessa and I will talk a bit more about this on Thursday as well, the particular role of infrastructure in climate responses in cities. And the consequences of different kinds of infrastructure for different groups within cities. So there are long lists of climate change resilient infrastructure, the physical infrastructure through things like the ways in which houses are built, designed and constructed, the ways in which particular transportation, IT, energy infrastructure is made more resilient in response to higher temperatures or to more extreme weather events. A growing focus on natural infrastructure, ecosystem-based adaptation, nature-based solutions, and long lists of the kinds of nature-based infrastructure that can be implemented for reducing climate risk. Coastal ecosystems, mangrove restoration, forest reforestation, refurbishing, restoring floodplains and wetlands. And a third category that's less physical, but more around the social infrastructure, and the way in which cities are planned, and the way in which social protection and livelihoods are put into place around safety nets and social insurance, the health responses to climate change, improving primary healthcare systems, or improving public health infrastructure. And all of these can have some levels of relevance for resilience and inclusion, particularly for low-income groups, recognizing that many of these different infrastructures meet the particular public needs, which should be public goods within cities. And we can see how these can apply directly in low-income and informal settlements as well. Actions can be taken to reduce exposure of low-income and informal settlements to climate-related hazards, storms or surface drains, hazard-proof housing and infrastructure, risk-sensitive land use planning, but also actions that can be taken to reduce the vulnerability, to improve the capacity, the adaptive capacity of low-income groups to respond to shocks and stresses in a more effective way. We start here as well, though, to see another concept, which is the limits to adaptation. And to think back to the very first slide of what the likely extent of global warming will be without more significant global action on emissions reductions. Those limits to adaptation will become greater and greater as the extent of global climate change becomes greater and greater. But infrastructure alone isn't going to be sufficient in addressing the extent of the climate challenge in cities. A starting point is that infrastructure does need to be resistant to the effects of climate change, but this in itself is not sufficient to accelerate effective climate action. And so we tried to pick out ways in which just making a road, a transportation network, an energy distribution, generation and distribution network, a water storage and reticulation network in itself more resilient does not necessarily contribute to the resilience of the city as a whole or the resilience of particular groups within that city. And we can see that many infrastructures can actually erode resilience. That where there is a strong reliance on informal livelihoods, the simple effort to create new formal livelihoods can further exclude low-income and marginalised groups from labour markets. Or efforts to improve the quality of housing and infrastructure has often led to gentrification of neighbourhoods and the displacement of the people who live in them. And there's a growing literature on climate gentrification as a process which further spatially marginalises low-income groups and pushes them onto hazard-prone land elsewhere as well. Or things like addressing land tenure as an issue. Often it results in the eviction of people without land titles, often without fair compensation, or onto land which is vulnerable elsewhere. So infrastructure in itself can erode resilience, and that can be true of nature-based infrastructure as well. So this is work led by a PhD student that I worked with at the development planning unit a few years ago, looking at nature-based solutions to climate change in São Paulo in Brazil, where we get these very contrasting views from the project implementers. An architect who says the community loved everything that we were doing in terms of stream restoration and nature-based approach to reducing surface runoff, reducing flooding. Whereas the responses from the residents give a very different picture. Indeed, another one of the papers that came out of this PhD research was titled, "It Won't Work Here." The approach in recognizing that an external vision of what stream restoration and nature-based approaches would be wouldn't function in the particular context where there was distrust of institutions and where the visions for what was being come up with were coming from urban designers and planners with very little reference to the needs or priorities of the people in the community. We also would often hear when you speak with mayors and city planners that it's really important to have more strong building regulations, to enforce building regulations more rigidly, to have better planning and better enforcement of regulations. And I think when these are applied in many ways that they often are applied, they can erode resilience as well. And that top-down planning, top-down mapping of hazards often acts as a basis for legitimizing evictions or eroding social fabric or removing people from the situations where they are able to access their livelihoods. Or that building regulations that are often based on colonial building regulations and colonial planning schemes which were never intended to apply to the majority of people living in the city, as it were. Make decent construction unaffordable and block access to more formally recognized housing. So ideas around incremental upgrading, thinking about in situ upgrading, and thinking about more appropriate standards, like, for example, smaller plot sizes, which shifts the economy around land and access to land in cities, which can broaden access to housing with good enough tenure, with secure enough tenure, with enough security, as a way of thinking differently about planning and building regulations in response to disaster and climate risk. So we can then try and build that picture up a little bit more to think about responses to vulnerability through different kinds of infrastructure, not through infrastructure that just is in itself resistant to climate impacts, but through infrastructure that enables social responses to the underlying drivers and the underlying stresses. So resilience building infrastructure that either integrates informal livelihoods in service provision, or at a more transformative level, integrates informal livelihoods within wider service delivery models for the city. Or about dealing with poor quality housing by community-led upgrading that supports incremental design and it enhances residents' access to urban services and social networks, rather than simply putting in place new large-scale housing which excludes or is unaffordable. Lots of issues around infrastructure that improves service access and also improves participation in the planning, design and delivery of these service models, or that not only goes beyond eviction to recognizing de facto tenure rights and then actually legitimizing different forms of land rights. So this was a process really of trying to think through how can we move from thinking just about infrastructure that is resilient to infrastructure that builds the conditions for resilience and for groups that are often low-income or marginalized groups within cities. So that then gives a broader picture, transformative infrastructure that builds social and economic resilience of urban residents, that addresses the drivers of both climate change and of vulnerability, recognizing that this needs to be done in a way that doesn't increase emissions unsustainably. And it has an element of community-led service provision, and that incorporates and works with informally built and managed infrastructure as well as formal infrastructure. So an example that I think begins to tie some of these ideas together, looking at the way in which organized groups of low-income residents can work together for different forms of housing construction, and that transforms governance relationships as well as transforming the built structures. So this is the Ginger Materials Workshop in Uganda, led by the informal, the network of slum dwellers in Uganda and a support NGO with a global component as well. Whereas a communal process rather than an individual one, it's possible to try out different forms of building technologies. And this is very different from the new forms of building technologies. I mean, the name of my institute has housing studies in it as well. I'm approached really often by people who say, we've got this wonderful new technology from bamboo or from this kind of waste, and if only everybody would start building and using these kinds of materials, it would solve the problems of affordability and quality of housing. But these are often externally put in place, whereas this is a driven approach from the community groups themselves through networks that they have internationally across borders in East Africa as well, to think about new forms of building technologies that are cheaper, that are more carbon efficient, and that have improved qualities for things like thermal comfort and for the strength of buildings. That these are community-wide processes that think about community sanitation and using things like rainwater harvesting and drainage to reduce flood risk or to store water. So a range of physical interventions which are locally driven and done through capacitated local organisations that respond very directly to the experiences of climate change, but that also restructure the relations between citizens and local government. This is not just about showing that it's possible to build using different materials. It's about negotiating with the local authorities around what kinds of building techniques are permissible and allowed within city boundaries. So it's an institutional and governance change as much as it is a change in the physical structure of construction. So then I think this begins to lead towards thinking about climate justice. So taking the urban climate emergency into account, taking into account the ways in which urban risk is actively created, not just passively received as a consequence of changes in the climate. Thinking about these particular issues for low-income and marginalised communities. What does this mean for conceptions of urban climate justice? What does this mean in terms of putting an idea like this, which draws on procedural and distributive framings, been expanded by many people to include other lenses like corrective and recognitional and transitional justice? And what does it mean in ways that accept there is a global climate emergency and a need to reduce emissions, as well as a need to reduce risk? And this is in a context where so many of the efforts to address the global climate emergency have negative or perverse outcomes for low-income groups. Tom, you mentioned conversations with Liza. This is work that comes from the African Centre for Cities, looking at energy transitions in cities in Africa, which are formatted to serve the epistemic, economic and geopolitical interests of global north actors, rather than attend to the needs and risks of African contexts. Or a really nice report from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, making the case that equity and decarbonisation are not mutually exclusive, but are mutually reinforcing. And it's a very nice empirical report there as well, because it shows that where issues of equity are not included, decarbonisation projects are more likely to fail. So it's not a moral argument that it's good to have greater equity. It's a pragmatic argument as well that says decarbonisation projects will not succeed without a simultaneous focus on equity. And a lot of this is the negative consequences from mitigation actions to reduce atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations, which don't consider low-income and informal settlements, which don't align with efforts to promote social justice, which do have so much of an element of elite capture, and which don't focus on equity in participation. So we end up with conundrums like the one here on the right, where so much of the way in which waste is managed in low and middle income cities is done through informal waste picking. Not a desirable way of managing waste at all. Huge amounts of methane emitted from decomposing waste, huge amounts of human suffering from the unsafe and unpleasant working conditions. But the response has too often been simply a mass mechanization, where you can measure the reduced emissions from a landfill site, but where there is no calculation for what this means for the livelihood or well-being of the people who used to work on waste picking. So we then search for examples such as those by Chintan in India or by WeGo worldwide, where there are different models of involving waste pickers in climate responses. Or where there are policy instruments like feed-in tariffs to encourage the use of solar generation, which works very well if you're living in a house like one at the bottom, but doesn't work very well at all if you're accessing your energy like the one at the top. So what are the examples then that we can look to for affordable small-scale solar? And what are some of the policy instruments? So in Zimbabwe, actually the last time Tom and I were there together, we're finding out that there'd been a removal of import tariffs on small solar panels, which had meant there was a huge expansion of access to solar energy in low-income and informal settlements in Harare. So what are the mechanisms that go beyond some of these, what we've seen very much as these dichotomies in responses? So then just transitions in practice that do take into account both the spatial dynamics and the social dynamics of equity and justice. The spatial dynamics within cities, where people are located, what access people have to services in the city. The social dynamics, who has this access, who is included or excluded in decision making and in reaping being affected by the costs or reaping the benefits from these projects around climate responses. A response to nature-based solutions that neither throws these out entirely, but does apply a critical lens to their application, that sees nature-based solutions not as inherently positive. And it's very appealing in a policy space to use words like nature or ecosystems as something which almost by necessity must be good and positive, whereas in fact it's necessary to unpack the different drivers and elements of them as well. What does this mean in some of the key sectors which are important for how people can be involved and take part in urban life and can realize their full potential? Sectors like shelter, sectors like energy, food, water and sanitation. So issues around the availability and the affordability of land, or the participatory approaches to informal settlement upgrading, addressing the shelter needs, which are substantial in ways that speak to just transitions. Are energy transitions applied in very top-down ways and technologically heavy ways, or are they applied in ways in which low-income and informal workers can be involved in energy upgrading and can be involved in the creation of off-grid or microgrid solutions? Urban food security, and what are the ways in which local markets can be supported to provide affordable and nutritious food in a context where very often the climate issues around food are framed around agricultural failure rather than around the provision of markets and distribution networks that get nutritious and affordable food to the people who need it most. And then in adaptation, and what are the processes of adaptation planning that bring marginalized groups more into the processes of adaptation planning to make sure that they are responsive to their needs and priorities? And so some of it goes across cities, some of it goes within participatory approaches within cities. And so much of it also can draw on what we know already from urban governance and urban participation, going beyond large scale and top-down master planning to thinking more about urban policy and planning tools that address climate issues at multiple scales. So just going to close by coming back to a conception that also comes from the IPCC, the idea of climate resilient development, which was really the ending point from the last IPCC assessment cycle. And I think this can be seen as an integrative framework. It's an idea that mitigation, reducing emissions, that adaptation, responding to risks, and sustainable development need to be brought together in a common framework. So it's an integrative framework. It's intended to be a synthesis of different conclusions that bringing together different areas of arenas of engagement with different dimensions and improving decision-making in these will lead to better outcomes. That's the synthesis or the argument that is being made here. It's being applied as an advocacy tool, a tool to all of these different points in the middle of the graph being decision points at which institutions, governance, and civil society actors can make decisions that lead to more or less climate resilient development outcomes. So an advocacy tool to encourage this to be actors to make those choices. It's also a kind of framework for evaluation and future research. And we can test it. We can say, does A lead to B, lead to C? If we do apply these different dimensions in different arenas of engagement in community, political, ecological arenas of engagement, will it lead us to more climate resilient development? So that then maybe leads to some research agendas. Do making positive societal choices actually result in climate resilient development pathways? How do different ways of engaging in these different arenas result in more or less effective outcomes? What are the conditions in which more climate resilient development decisions are made and implemented? Or how can we track and measure climate resilient development? So I think these are some of the areas in which, if we're thinking about urban infrastructures, urban informalities, and urban climate policies, where there is a significant need for engaged academic research, new areas of analysis, and transdisciplinary and integrated approaches in the ways that those of us who were here earlier started talking about what's being done in urban institutes around the world. Thanks.